Gangs of young men and youths known as larrikins, or pushers, existed for decades in Sydney, annoying law-abiding citizens and committing petty crimes, and sometimes more serious offences. On New Year's Eve, 31st of December 1935, at 11:30pm, a group of teenagers were taunting passengers and refusing to pay their fares on a tram in Elizabeth Street, near Albion Street. When asked to leave the tram by the conductor, they refused, so the conductor felt compelled to summon police assistance. Constables Archinall and Blackman arrived, prompting the men to run from the tram down Terry Lane. Constable Archinall pursued them down the lane and caught up to one of the gang. He was leaning over the man about to make an arrest when another man bumped into him. The man on the ground scrambled up and ran. The man who had jumped over Archinall stopped, turned, and fired off 2 shots at the constable. The shots missed, but were heard by another policeman, 26-year-old John Turbot, who was passing by the lane in a car. Meanwhile, Archinall continued the chase, undaunted by the attempt to shoot him. Telling Sergeant All to take the wheel and jumping from the vehicle, Constable Turbot joined the pursuit, firing a shot at the group as they turned into Foveaux Street and then into Elizabeth Street, where the gunman was struck by a taxi. This brought him to a stop, and Turbot was almost upon him when the man turned and fired 2 more shots from less than 10 feet away. Turbot was shot through the forehead above the right eye, the bullet emerging through the back of his head. The constable fell to the pavement, further injuring himself by fracturing his skull. He lay near the entrance to the underground station at the corner of Eddy Street in a critical condition before being taken to Sydney Hospital. The gunman was followed by other officers but soon lost in the darkened maze of streets and alleyways of Surrey Hills. The Commissioner of Police was informed, and soon every police officer who could be spared from other duties was put into the effort to locate the teenage hoodlums responsible. Among those police were Turbot's 2 brothers. Also informed was Turbot's wife, who had been waiting at home to celebrate the arrival of the new year with her husband. On receiving the news, she collapsed at their mascot home. On the morning of New Year's 1936, an operation was performed to relieve pressure on the brain and stabilise Turbot's condition, but recovery was considered unlikely. Turbot regained consciousness around midday on the 1st of January, but his survival was still considered improbable. But by the next day, though he was still not out of danger, doctors tentatively gave him a fighting chance of recovery. His wife remained near her husband the whole time, sleeping at the hospital when she could sleep, only going home for an hour per day. "He has fought," she said, "and should I not help him fight? He is my life's partner. He is a good man, and I could never find another like him." Meanwhile, known hangouts of members of the underworld were being raided all over Sydney in search of the youthful gunman. An appeal was made for information from passengers on the tram and to other members of the gang. The Chief Secretary of New South Wales, who was the ministerial head of the police force, declared he would amend the firearms laws to toughen them up. At that time, any weapon with a barrel longer than 9 inches did not require a gun licence. By Friday, the 3rd of January, a squad of 40 officers was still hunting the young man who had shot Turbot. Although they did not release details to the public, they had already identified the man they sought as an 18-year-old named James Alfred Penrose, born Arthur James Penrose in 1917. Penrose was well known to the police, having been in trouble for minor offences since he was 9 years old. Ominously, one of those arrests was for possessing an unlicensed gun. Described as the leader of a gang of young hooligans, he was said to always carry 2 fully loaded revolvers with him, which he would flourish on the slightest provocation. His first arrest had been when he had tried to buy a train ticket from Sydney to Perth with £20 he had stolen. Although he had been sent to corrective homes, they had not tamed his wild streak, and he soon had a record of assault, break and enter, and stealing. On one occasion he had been threatened by a detective at Redfern Police Station, exasperated by the boy's insolence. "You're a cheeky young cove. You'll be getting something you don't relish." "Oh, will I?" responded Penrose. "You cop this." Having said so, the small youth grabbed a chair and smashed it over the detective, knocking out his front teeth. Then Penrose leapt out of a window 25 feet to the street below and raced away. 6 weeks before shooting Constable Turbot, he had been arrested for breaking into a factory and given a 6-month sentence, but was instead released on a bond. 2 weeks later, he was arrested for a robbery at a house at Randwick. His mother had died when he was young, years before, and then his father died in 1931, after which he had lived with his grandmother up until her death in July 1935. Since then, he had no fixed address. Instead, he wandered the streets of Redfern, Waterloo, and adjacent suburbs, gaining a reputation as a gunman. He had gained an education, receiving both his intermediate and leaving certificates at high school, and liked to read true crime magazines. 2 weeks before New Year's Eve, he broke into Booth's Bakery at Mascot and stole the revolver with which he would later shoot the constable. Penrose had attended a poker party in Walker Street, Redfern, around 10 p.m. on New Year's Eve, but had been detected cheating and was tossed out of the premises. In the struggle, he drew one of his guns and fired, the bullet grazing one man. Then, in his anger, fired off a few more shots in the street. When the shells collected from that scene were compared and matched to those at the location of the shooting of Constable Turbot, police were certain of the man they sought. The police search was centred on the inner southern suburbs of Surrey Hills, Redfern and Waterloo. Saturday night, the 4th of January, was rainy, and the police search of empty houses and local parks had come up empty. Trains were closely observed for any sign of the wanted fugitive, but he failed to appear. No doubt dispirited by their lack of success and the long drawn-out hours they spent on it, the police were enlivened when they saw Joyce Chandler, the 14-year-old girlfriend of Penrose, sneaking out of her home at Elizabeth Street, Waterloo. Stealthily they began shadowing her, hoping she would lead them to their quarry. Although she checked behind herself, she failed to notice the police hidden in the dark. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning on the 5th of January 1936, and she went to an address in Lenton Parade, Waterloo, with half a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. There stood a dilapidated building of 2 stories with a cellar at the back. Penrose had taken refuge there and smashed a hole through the connecting wall in the cellar into that of an abandoned building next door. The building next door had a breach in the wall through which Penrose could look out over a vacant allotment, providing an emergency escape. The girl remained a couple of hours until the early streamers of dawn lightened the sky. The police held off on raiding the building in case she was harmed. Joyce was a piece worker at a mica trading company who had known Penrose for 4 months. A tall girl with her hair shaped in an Eton crop, she and Penrose had gone to the pictures on the evening of the 4th of January and had then set up their current rendezvous. While they sat and talked, he showed her his gun. She thought it was an automatic. He said he only had 1 cartridge left, and if the police came, he'd shoot himself. Before she left, she asked Penrose to give her the gun, but he was adamant that he would not be taken alive. As soon as the girl left, the police stealthily crept up to the building and grabbed her. She shouted a warning, but it was too late. Detective Sergeant McCarthy quickly entered the back gate and ran towards the building when he saw the back door open and the figure of a man taking cover behind it. Reports of what happened next varied to some degree. One account has it that the man beside the door fired a shot at McCarthy, which missed. The policeman dodged aside and fired wide with his own weapon and called on the man to put up his hands and surrender. The answer came as another shot of gunfire from inside the building. Police surged forward and found Penrose with a self-inflicted wound in his right temple. The young man was dead. The entire shootout had only taken a few seconds to occur. A second version was that Penrose was hiding in the cellar and McCarthy, shining a torch around, found him, and seeing Penrose's hand sweep to his pocket, fired at him first, but missed. Hearing the shots, Joyce, who had been bundled into a police car, stifled a scream and nearly collapsed. A note was allegedly found in Penrose's pocket saying that he could not find a job and had to resort to stealing to live. He said he hated the thought of jail and would rather die. It also revealed he had concealed the clothes he was wearing when he had shot Turbot on a vacant block in Cleveland Street. The house was searched and the body removed to the morgue. Surprisingly, the funeral was rushed and the youth was buried the same afternoon. Soon after, rumours circulated that Penrose had been gunned down in cold blood by the police, or at best McCarthy had fired only with the intention of scaring Penrose, but accidentally shot him. At the inquest in February, the coroner determined suicide was the cause of death and commented that Penrose must have had some defect which led him into a life of crime. The Labour Daily newspaper's edition of the 7th of January 1936 commented on the note left behind by Penrose. The editor wrote, "Adverse economic conditions are the infallible crime maker, and the theory that most criminals are born and not made is fast falling into the discard." The writer added, "One of the saddest sights that can be seen today in Sydney streets is that of young lads looking for work, wistfully peering in at factories, workshops, mills and garages, watching other persons doing the work that they themselves gladly would like to do. What the youth of this state desire is work. This is the most pressing problem of 1936. Archinall and Turbot were promoted to first-class constables in April 1936. Jack Turbot returned to work later in the year, but continued to suffer from the effects of the shooting, and retired in January 1937, receiving a pension at full pay. Turbot's wife died in 1970. He remarried and passed away himself at the age of 87 on the 17th of July 1996. Joyce Chandler is believed to have later married and passed away in 1991.